The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter.
Welcome to the Informal Book Club, where Vivian Dudro and Joseph Pearce, myself, Father Fessio, here also, and Joseph Pearce in Greenville, South Carolina, will begin discussing a different kind of book for our reading group here, called Science at the Doorstep to God by Father Robert Spitzer, a fellow Jesuit whom I've known for many years, who is a wonderful priest and a scholar. He's a scientist as well as a person with a great Dolores background. He was president of Gonzaga University for about 10 years. And here he is going to show how science actually strengthens our faith in God. Contrary to the opinion that scientists are atheists or agnostic, he shows that not only are most of them, the majority of them, not atheistic, but rather believers in some religion, but also that what they're finding is supportive of what we know by faith and what we believe. Now, this book, I want to see how this goes, because he is quoting and citing many scientists on very abstruse, speculative, theoretical theories. And we either have to simply take his word for that's what the consensus is among these scientists, or what none of us are capable of doing, go into the details of the scientific experiments on which these theories are based. So let's see what these scientists have to say, and we'll kind of use the standard of common sense. This book is not written for other scientists, it's written for ordinary people, but there's a lot of very esoteric material that we're going to be covering here. However, I will say that Father Spitzer he repeats himself a lot, which is good, because as he says a second time, you've got more to judge it by because of what you read prior to that. I want to start the very, very beginning of the little acknowledgement here. It's an unnumbered page. Well, it's the first thing you get after the front matter. It's in memory of Father Joseph Fessio, another fine Jesuit, died not too long ago. But in the middle, that little acknowledgement, he says, additionally, in memory of Father William Wallace, OP, Dominican, former professor of philosophy of science. And I remember years ago reading some of the works of Father Wallace, who wrote them in the 40s, actually. But it was one of the most comprehensive and penetrating analyses of what science actually is and what it can tell you, what it can't tell you, that I'd come across at that time. So I'm happy to find that Father Spitzer was influenced by him, probably when he was in Washington, D.C. The table of contents is very explicit and very well, subdivided. So you can kind of get anywhere we're going in this book, and also go back and kind of do a summary for yourself. We start on page 15 with the introduction, which at the beginning is a little heavy because it's really kind of a condensed summary, wasn't it, in the book. So the introduction, I would say, is not as easy to comprehend until after you finish the book. Well, most people write introductions that way. They write the book and then introduce it. I want to have a little nitpicking at the very beginning here. He says, very first sentence, the landscape is changing. The boundary between faith and science is breaking down. Well, that's not true. The boundary is as clear as it ever was. But the boundary between believers and scientists is breaking down. And there's a lot of scientists who are believers. So in that sense, we see faith and science personally united in a lot of people. But faith is faith and science is science. They're two forms of knowledge, but they are completely distinct. And he does a wonderful job in this introduction in the book of explaining just what science does and what it can't do.
Yeah, but the one thing, I mean, I hadn't really noticed that when I first read it, but the other thing about it, of course, is there's an ambiguity there because the boundary between faith and science is breaking down suggests that that there was a fundamental separation. Now, you talked about there is a separation in terms of what one is as distinct from the other, but the idea of faith and reason, right, being inextricably connected. There's a suggestion here that faith and reason haven't always been inextricably connected, but now the boundaries are breaking down, and we're beginning to see that they are. In other words, the suggestion is that there's not a permanent reality here, an unchanging reality, that faith and reason are ultimately wedded and not divorced. So, yeah, I think it's an unfortunate first sentence, which I didn't notice till you mentioned it. I know what he's saying. He's using poetic language, allusive language, metaphorical language, which it obviously is necessary if we're going to read. But in a scientific book, you've got to be very careful the way you use those sorts of things.
And in that first paragraph, he mentions eternal inflation, which is not a reference to American society as we know it these days, but to the cosmological theories of the beginning of the universe. When I say beginning, as we'll see it means that the first trillionth of a second or so, 10 to the 9, 10 to the 12 seconds, 10 to the 20 seconds, minus 20th. And about infinite multiverses. And we'll see, he explains it well. We're going to see here that scientists, in one sense, they're trying to find a natural explanation for things. And they go to such extremes that their apparent natural explanation is far more incredible than simply believing there's a creator who did all this. Because they're speculative. Well, maybe there's billions and trillions of other universes and we're just one bubble in that, Well, what is your basis for that? What observation have you made leads you to that? He's going to talk about that.
Yes.
And at the bottom of the paragraph, first paragraph, whether ours is a multiverse, a bouncing universe, or simply our universe. What does he mean by that? We're going to see. He goes into detail here, but multiverse meaning that we are part of a family of universes, but of different dimension of our own, that we can't see them, or we can't perceive them. A bouncing universe, the Big Bang, the origin, which they posit 13 billion years ago, universe expanding. Well, some are saying, well, yeah, but it's gonna bounce back, and it's gonna be like a bouncing ball, keep bouncing. He's gonna go into that theory, and finally, our universe. What do we really have? What are we living in here? So, introduction.
Well, the main point of that paragraph seems to be, which clarifies maybe what he said too ambiguously in the first sentence. What he clarifies here at the end, the preponderance of cosmological evidence has shifted toward a beginning of physical reality. So when I read that sentence, I then thought back to, so when he talks about a boundary, what he's really saying is that for a long time now, these scientists have set out to prove or try to find evidence for that there was no beginning. Because if there's a beginning, then the question, how did it begin, or what began it? There's something outside of it that must have begun it, Well, to avoid this question, scientists have done all of these mental gymnastics, and you realize just how reading this stuff, you're like, whoa, what?
Yeah, so what he really means in that first sentence, which is made clear from the final sentence you mentioned there, is that the false dichotomy is breaking down. Right?
Yes.
That's what's breaking down, is the false dichotomy.
A false dichotomy, and the fact that modern scientists of a certain time period just went full throttle to try to demonstrate somehow that the universe itself was infinite in one way or another. And that's all breaking down now.
Yeah, their discipline, basically, I mean, their methodology precludes faith, right? Their methodology precludes faith, the physical sciences. So they wanted to be able to prove that what they do contains truth. I mean, all of the truth. that if you can't prove something according to their methodology, it isn't true. Therefore, that which can't be proved by their methodology is ipso facto untrue. And what he actually shows here is there's all sorts of the rules of non-contradiction, all sorts of fundamental logical fallacies have to be committed in order to actually hold that position.
And that's one of the great things about this book, I think. It really helps sharpen your logical reasoning skills as he starts to show you the flaws in these theories, that they don't hold up. They don't hold up to scrutiny. And so that's such a helpful thing, because I don't understand these theories. But when Father Spitzer explains their logical fallacies, oh, I can see that, right? And so anyway, it's a great service he's done putting all this in one place.
Before we get off the first page here, I do want to say something just by way of analogy that I found very encouraging. So the final sentence of the second paragraph, this may be part of the reason that a large percentage of young scientists consider themselves believers in God or a higher spiritual reality. So, I couldn't help seeing an analogy here with, a large percentage of young vocations, large percentage of young priests. In other words, the new generation have sort of broken away from this modernism, now whether it's the scientific modernism or philosophical modernism or theological modernism, they've sort of broken away from it, and they're actually coming back to a firm grasp of first principles, whether they're scientific or theological or philosophical.
And here's my theory behind that most people who have children are normal people, not the elites who are trying to avoid having children. And therefore we have, since the children are now being born by ordinary people for the most part, who are generally traditional, that we're getting a lot of young priests and young scientists who have been brought up in an environment which has not been overly influenced by false philosophies that are kind of floating in our atmosphere. On page 16, the little paragraph in the middle there, this both continues the ambiguity and resolves it. When we combine all of these findings, which he refers to above, with contemporary philosophical arguments, that is to say, we combine scientific arguments for the likelihood there's a God with philosophical arguments that there must be a God for the existence of God and a soul. The idea of a boundary between science and faith seems melting away. That is a boundary in the sense that there are two irreconcilable ways of looking at the world, and those believers believe in God and scientists don't believe in God. That boundary is melting away.
Yes, that's a really good way to put it, Father, that the notion that these were irreconcilable differences, that you just had these two camps of people and never the twain shall meet, that's what's breaking down.
On the first section, Roman number 1, are scientists really atheists? Now he goes through these surveys, and it's interesting to have that, but two things. One, the argument from authority is the weakest of arguments. So just the fact that a lot of scientists believe in God is not really an argument. But secondly, who are these scientists that they're interviewing? I don't think they're talking about political scientists, economists, psychologists, or sociologists. We'll see later he refers to biologists, chemists, and physicists. And
he does say on page 17 that the Journal of Religion and Health, well, that could be anything, right? You say it could be sociologists, these quasi pseudoscientists, but he says 76% of physicians are believers in God.
But they're not scientists.
Well, no. So I was thinking about physics,
and that's a different set. No, and I think he's only pointing out he's not using this as a proof in the existence of God, which you're right is a logical fallacy to appeal to authority. He's using
a weak argument, not a fallacy.
A weak argument. He's using this simply to demonstrate that these boundaries have weakened.
Right.
That's what. Right. So in that sense, it actually does prove his statement that these boundaries have weakened, and it isn't as though to be a scientist you must be an atheist. right?
If I can also be a pedant here, if you don't mind, and that first paragraph, he mentions he lumps together agnostics and atheists, and I just think that's not good, because I consider myself being agnostic prior to my conversion, but if you ask me did God exist, I'd probably say, well, probably. Right. But the point is, I don't know, and I'm not all that bothered. And, so I don't think an agnostic can be grouped with an atheist. An atheist is someone who affirms as a scientific or philosophical fact that there is no God. An agnostic is someone who doesn't know or doesn't care. I mean, it's not the same thing,
Yeah, I
No,
agree with you.
But well, except he's trying to say how many scientists are religious, that is, they do believe in God. And what's the other category? Well, the other category is those who don't believe in God, whether they just don't know or whether they disbelieve. So I can justify thinking.
I called myself an agnostic. I self-identified as an agnostic, but I probably believed in God. In other words, it seemed to me I just look at out there. There's always the argument from beauty, right? Look out there, and is it possible that all of this is an accident? Unlikely, but beyond that, I didn't really.
But he's talking about believing. Agnostics do not believe in God. The word means I don't know.
Right. That's right. So Father's point, he's just separating those who believe and those who haven't made an affirmation of belief, either because they believe it's opposite or they don't believe anything at all per se. So that's not an unfair distinction to make.
Well, I just think that those who don't know is very different from those who do know that God doesn't exist.
Yeah,
they are different. There's a difference between agnostics and atheists, but both of them are in a class of those who do not positively affirm God.
Right.
Yes.
That's the point. And then, we can, if we want to find out, well, which scientists are these, we could look up this Pew study if we wanted to. It's online, and just see who the people were. And I also want to point out in the footnotes that these are two different studies, the study of the scientists and the study of the physicians. So these are not being lumped together. That's important.
Right.
And why would it be that physicians tend to believe in God? And I think the answer is they deal with the human body and how it works. And they know how little we know about the body, how it works, and how phenomenal it is. Every system, the relation of the systems, all these things. It's hard to study the human body in detail and not be filled with wonder and awe in a sense of, wow, this couldn't just happen,
I agree with all that, Father, but the other thing about if you want to become a physician, there's something humane about it. In other words, you actually like other people and you want to help other people, and so there is that philosophical, even emotional aspect, I think, to someone that wants to have a vocation to be a physician. Which doesn't, you said, it just adds to it.
I found very interesting that 73% of physicians believe that miracles occur in the present. And that related to what Father just said about they know that there's a lot they don't know and a lot that they don't understand. And doctors see on a fairly regular basis cures, recoveries that can't be accounted for with the knowledge they know. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's a miracle, but it does make you wonder. And wonder is the beginning point for God, right? So but I was surprised at how high that number was until I started to think about, well, what do doctors see on a daily basis? They see a lot of crazy stuff that they can't explain.
Good. Anything else on that first section on scientists being atheists or not?
I have nothing else highlighted to page 24, so I'm going to cede the floor.
24 or 34?
24.
Okay, good. So part two, what science can and cannot do. This is a very helpful thing where he just in a very succinct way shows what the scientific method is. So part 1, 2, 3, hypothesis, test and predictions of the hypothesis, and experimental validation. That's what you do. And it's all based on what you can measure and observe.
Yep. And there's a lot.
It's very, very good that he begins with insisting that science, any argument from science is subject to the scientific method. That's what he's doing. You can't prove something scientifically unless you're going to be scientific about it.
Right. And guess what? There's a lot to reality that we can't experiment with. So there's a lot to know that we can't know by this means.
Now, on the middle of page 21, a little above the middle, it says, science cannot make adequate judgments about realities or hypothesized realities that are not observable or physical in space and time and having measurable properties or beyond the observable and physical world. I'm going to qualify that. He does it later as well. But science speaks about with authority over things which are observable and measurable. But you may have heard this, it's true, that of the universe we know, only 5% is observable and measurable. 25%, they're calling it dark matter, which simply means we're pretty sure it's there, we don't know what it is, we can't observe it. And 70% is dark energy, which again means there's got to be some cause out there because we see the effects, but we can't observe it. They only observe effects which they can't account for in other ways. We'll see that in more detail. But it's like the discovery of the planet, if you call it a planet, Pluto, that as measurement got better, astronomical measurements, they could see how different planets act on each other, and there was an anomaly there. And they said, there must be some body out there we can't see, we haven't found it yet, and or it must be here, and it must have this mass to it, and they kept looking, and they found it where they expected it to be. So did they know Pluto was there before they discovered it? Well, they knew something was there.
How long, Father, between the time they theorized it was there and the time they actually saw it?
I don't know. We'll have to Google
I
that.
know it was discovered in 1930 because that was the year my father was born, and I made that association. But
okay,
I do know.
All right.
So that's so. But to finish your point, Father, which I think is really important. So, the thing itself, Pluto, could neither be observed nor measured, but there were other things being affected by it that could be observed and measured.
Right.
That allowed us to conclude that the probability of something being there was very, very high. With certainty, even. Okay, yeah. Okay. So that is an important qualification.
But but Pluto was in principle observable and measurable.
It's just we didn't have the tools to do it yet.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, dark matter and dark energy, because what's observable mean? It means it's radiating something, because it's light or heat, cosmic rays. That's what we're perceiving. We don't see the thing itself directly. We receive the radiation from it. Or we feel a tug. That is to say, if our eyes were closed, we know we were on Earth because, well, we get so used to it, we don't think it. But basically, we're being sucked down by gravity. So,
what about hearing?
Well, hearing would be those would be vibrations, but they require medium, and so.
So you're saying that even hearing is coming from an observable something.
Yeah.
In the same.
Yeah. Observe. Okay. Observe doesn't necessarily mean visually observable. It means sensible.
Sensible. Okay.
You can touch things and smell things and so on.
And hear things. Okay. So, but the senses, in other words.
Yeah.
Observable means it has to be something the senses can pick up.
Right.
What you seem to be talking about, Father, is that this thing is measurable. Dark energy, dark matter. It's measurable in the sense that we know that there's something's happening that there's no other reason for, but we can't actually measure it. That's a contradiction. But you know what I mean? We don't know what it
is. There's no direct measure you can make. That's right.
Right, but we can measure that. We measure the what's the word? We measure the effects, but we can't measure the cause.
Right.
Right.
And we know the cause has to be adequate to the effect. That's a philosophical principle. I didn't underline much going forward because he kind of underlines it himself by summarizing it.
Mm-hmm.
I see you got a lot there, though.
I know, but that like some of these.
Well, I have page 24 if you're going beyond that, because I think this is where I'm very intrigued by excited by this congruence between philosophy and science. How basically we have to be philosophical even in our understanding of science. So may I read that paragraph beginning? So why is
Sure.
this important? So why is this important in a book about science, God, and the soul? If science must be falsifiable, we can't go back and give that argument. You can if you like, Father, you do it better than I would. Science must be falsifiable, then scientism, the view that every truth claim must be subject to scientific validation, must be false. Think about it. If science is dependent on the principle of non-contradiction and mathematics, and if these two truths are not falsifiable by observational data, which is needed to be scientific, then mathematics and non-contradiction cannot be scientifically validated. Thus, scientism rules out the truth of the preconditions for science itself, non-contradiction, and mathematics. So, I mean, the idea of non sequiturs and reductio ad absurdums, that at the very root of scientism, which he defines here as the view that every truth claim must be subject to scientific validation, is itself logically and scientifically absurd.
Yeah, he uses non-contradiction in mathematics as things which can't be validated scientifically. And I think that's a proper way of proceeding. There's another similar, principle or remark I'll make here, which Joseph, you've heard me say many times when we talk about Lewis's miracles, C.S. Lewis's miracles, that science is based on the firm conviction that if I perform this experiment 12 times, I can predict the 13th, because we expect laws to be there by which these patterns of repetition will recur in the same way. But as he makes very clear many times, all our observations have to be at a particular time and a place. We can't observe everything everywhere. We observe something here and something there, and we see they're similar. And we then make the assumption that the law we've discovered, the relationship, the pattern repetition is universal, that it applies everywhere. But that you can't possibly prove that. So all of science is based on the assumption that the laws of nature are universal, but you can't prove scientifically that the laws of nature are universal. And so science itself can't validate itself scientifically. That's his point he's making here, but this is another angle.
And this distinction, Father, between science, as in the physical sciences, natural philosophy, and mathematics. I mean, you and I both, and a mathematics professor at Edinburgh University. And if you were to say to him that he's a scientist, he would be offended. Because to him, mathematics is closer to philosophy. Now, so in other words, everything you just said there about the scientific method requires physical data based upon physics, right? Physical things you can observe. But mathematics is based upon abstract principles. That what 2 + 2 = 4. Or the area of a circle is what's that? 2 pi r squared. Is that correct?
You're right. Very good, Joseph.
I clutched that from my dim and distant past. This is mathematics. It's not subject to scientific principle. These are things that cannot be contradicted because that's what a circle is, right? When you see a circle, you can work out what its area is. You can work out circumference is through mathematical formula. That's not science.
Well, and you can reduce it to this: the statement, "No, nothing is true that unless it can be verified empirically." Well, you can't verify that statement empirically, so
Yes.
you're going to cut yourself.
Yes, indeed.
Vivian, I see a lot of underlining there.
Well, just this point that he's outlining here the limits of science, what it can do and what it can't do. And if something, he says, I'm going backtrack a little bit just because this popped out at me on 21, if something is beyond observation within our universe, then this is in the middle of the second paragraph, toward the end, I guess. If it's beyond the observation within our universe, then this uncaused reality cannot be disproved by science.
You disprove. That's right.
Cannot be disproved. So, in other words, science can't disprove God. That is an absurd statement, and people make that statement all the time in just popular conversations about whether or not belief in God is crazy or not, and they'll just say, "Well, science has disproved God." No, that is impossible for science to do, and so this is such a helpful thing for him to explain in a very logical, sequential way what science can and cannot do, and so on page 26, his numbered list here, science cannot disprove the existence of God because science is restricted to observational data. That's just restating what I just read. But then he goes down the list of all the other things science cannot do. It cannot prove that the universe does not need a creator. It cannot disprove the existence of a transphysical soul. It cannot claim, and so on. I mean, it really isn't it empowering hearing about all the things that science can't do?
He's using pure reason, pure logic. He's not making any claims based upon any theological presumptions.
That's right.
This is pure logic.
That's
and
right.
if I can introduce, just to make sure I get the last thing I want to say, and after that I'll cede the floor before we finish. With that great scientific reality called patriotism. I want to make sure that we give St. John Henry Newman a little bit of a mention, because he's mentioned here. And Newman's a grammar of assent at the top. I assume we want to try to get to the end of the introduction. Do we or do we not, Father?
Oh.
Page 30.
Well, we can stop at the introduction, right? I mean, we can stop.
The introduction. The point is, I want to make sure, because we're running out of time, that at the top of page 28, beginning of section 3, John Henry Newman's informal inference. All right, so Newman's grammar of assent. Now, I don't think that Newman's grammar of assent is his greatest work. I don't think Newman's a philosopher per se, and I think in a grammar of assent there are some things a bit which are sort of somewhat, by his standards, slack as regards logic, but his central claim in the grammar of assent, and it's summed up in this sentence 5 lines down, by a combination, we can come to an assumption of truth by a combination of probabilistic arguments that he termed an informal inference. So these are not absolute proofs in a mathematical sense, or in an empirical sense, or a logical sense, but it's the sort of approach to science and reality that you might see in a court of law, right? Where you basically bring up the evidence. Let's look at all the evidence. And this is the evidence for one side, this is the evidence for the other side. And then the jury comes to a verdict based upon something being true beyond reasonable doubt.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an absolute certainty, but it's coming to a belief in something beyond reasonable doubt. And that's what Newman claims in the grammar of assent. We can do that by looking at the convergence of probabilities. And I'm glad he brings Newman into the conversation here.
Good. But I want to make a distinction within what you just said. What you said is true, but and both Newman and Father Spitzer developed that a bit by saying it's not just evidence that converges, but what really makes it more probable is when you have different mathematics points to it, and biology points to it, and the neighbor next door points to it, and that dog over there points to it. If you got 6 or 7 different paths which lead you to the same conclusion,
mm-hmm.
that's a lot stronger than having 6 paths from the same discipline, something like that.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, he says somewhere, maybe it's in the next chapter, but that science, the art of science, if you will, is an inferential undertaking. In other words, in order to put together a hypothesis to test in the first place, this is exactly what you've done. A real scientist these different points of things that seem to all be. So now, how do I test that? Now
Right.
I put together a hypothesis, but that was inductive reasoning, not deductive reasoning.
That's why,
Pearce brought that to view.
The imagination is as necessary for the physical sciences as it is for writing a sonnet.
Yes.
That's the actual key thing here that we need to understand.
Good. Let us conclude then with the end of chapter of the introduction. We'll start next session, page 31, chapter 1, Does Science Point to a Beginning of Our Universe? Thanks, everyone. See you next session.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumedbookclub.ignatius.com.